Welcome to the EdexLive podcast by the New Indian Express. On today's episode, we have the pleasure of speaking with Vibha Kagzi, the founder and CEO of ReachIvy, a leading education consultancy dedicated to empowering Indian students with the insights, strategies, and support they need to pursue higher education abroad. With years of experience navigating the complex landscape of international admissions, visa policies, and student wellness, Vibha offers a unique perspective on how students and counselors alike can adapt to the rapidly evolving challenges of global education. We're excited to hear Vibha's expert insights on how Indian students can best prepare for their academic journeys ahead. Vibha, thank you so much for joining us on the EdexLive podcast today. Welcome.
Thank you so much, and big fan of what you're doing, and really happy that you're providing a conduit for people to get the right access and right information. So, firstly, congratulations on your endeavor, and super excited to have this conversation.
Absolutely, that is the plan. Now, jumping right in with the recent US student visa pauses and the increased scrutiny of international students' digital footprints, how do you think these developments are affecting Indian students and their aspirations to study abroad?
The pause has actually been lifted, as you know. Will it come back? It could come back. There is a little bit of volatility in terms of signaling from the US government. The pause came towards the end of May. A lot of application decisions had already come through in December, January, February, and up to March. So, interestingly, a lot of students had already applied for and received their student visas. So, I think it was more from an optics perspective and sort of a signaling perspective that the government said, hey, we're going to pause these to sort of put out a very firm stance. There's two aspects to it. One is the scrutiny, and one is enforcing that you make your social media profiles public. That's really the clincher. You know, scrutiny has always happened. Colleges will also review your Facebook, Insta, LinkedIn, Twitter profiles. This has been happening for years. Even the universities always went through, and from a hygiene perspective, we'd always advocate to students clean up their digital footprints in any case, regardless of the Trump administration. For me, the big clincher is the fact that they want you to make them public. It's mandatory. But if you look at the fine print, what the fine print says is that the consular offices are going to look for posts, comments, or associations that indicate hostility towards the US, connections with banned groups, or hateful commentary. Now, put yourself or put myself in the position of the administration of any country. That seems fair. I don't want to bring somebody into my borders who's hostile towards me or is connected with banned groups, right? So that is really the official line that they are towing. Now, if you are somebody who fosters hostility towards the US, then it's probably not the right country for you to go to. Go study in Germany, go study in Singapore, stay in India. Now it's being interpreted saying, hey, but you're like stepping a line, you know, what happened to my privacy and my rights? But really, what they're saying is, as long as you're not associated with any hateful commentary, banned groups, or hostility towards the country, they're okay. So I think people have also, you know, they're reading too deeply into the fine print. But if you take the fine print for what it is on an as-is basis, it doesn't sound like it's really too radical. I don't think, like, honestly, the curriculum is so intense at high schools and at university level to get into these colleges in America that I really don't think there's that many students harboring hatred or, you know, part of banned groups. And if they are, then fair enough. Then the US is in the right place for them in any case.
Absolutely. And I mean, in the light of these uncertainties, how are counseling approaches evolving to help students remain informed, resilient in their decision making, you think?
I mean, that's the job of organizations like us. At ReachIvy, obviously, we are staying tuned to all the developments that are happening. We are also advocating to students to apply to multiple countries. So while we are not suggesting that you dismiss the US, we are definitely saying, hey, widen the option pool and also look at countries like Singapore, Canada, UK, France, Germany, Ireland, etc. The issue is that the statements are volatile and they're not taking a very firm stance. You know, they say something, then they pull back, they say something as they pull back. You know, this whole tussle with Harvard University, where they took a very firm stance saying we are now going to ban international students, we are banning your funding, to now them mellowing last week saying, hey, you know, we're going to reach a truce and, you know, we're going to provide full access to international students. it leads to a lot of confusion. And that's what's really the issue, the confusion and the lack of clarity. And to address that, we're telling students, look, we don't really know. So keep options open. At the very last moment, when you finally have to take the call, at that point, you assess the situation. Now, that being said, there's enough turmoil going on in different parts of the world as well. Something could happen here in India as well. So are you really at any point fully protected from the universe and everything that goes on? Probably not. So we're saying be ready for some level of volatility, but we're pretty certain that closer to decision time, they are going to put out a very strong statement. As of now, the universities are saying, look, it's all clear. If you were planning to come this fall to a US university, everything is clear. You're very welcome. And they are putting out a very strong statement from the college's perspective, like, all is well, please come, and we're going to take care of everything. So the universities are at least providing a very clear green signal to students, which is very comforting.
Yes. And given the rising geopolitical tensions, how would you advise students and families to future proof their education choices across countries and courses? Do you think there's a way to do that?
Now, look, historically, the United States, if you look at the data from the last 15 years, it's always been the number one study abroad destination, not just for Indian students, but globally. One wonders, why would you put this sort of preference and prominence? It's because the universities have been around for centuries. Harvard University has been around for over 400 years. So, one, they have this legacy of international education. Two, their cutting edge research. And three, most importantly, really why education for most people going abroad is a means to an end, and that end being employability. It's not education for the sake of education. It's really saying, hey, I will go get a degree in the United States or the UK or wherever to finally get a job. And it was that employment contract, that sort of light at the end of the tunnel, where you see so many immigrants move to the US and then sort of transform their lives. Now, when you're saying, how do you future proof this? This is the future proofing that is the underlying reason for why people leave India and go abroad, right? That's the future proofing from a country perspective. And that future proofing is still very much alive and kicking in the US and globally, right? Now, every country goes through its wave. Canada went through its immigration wave and said, hey, now we're going to stop. The UK went through its wave. So I think they, as the new administrations come through, they assess as of that point, how many people do they want in? How protectionist do they want to go as a country? What is the current climate? So going to these countries is really a function of, at what point did you apply and what cycle and what wave, it's an economic cycle. So this again is an economic cycle where they say, hey, we want to be a little protectionist. We want to protect our borders. But if you look at a macro trend, the macro trend of future proofing from an education and geographical perspective, the United States provides that future proofing, right? You end up going there, you end up getting those jobs, and you end up really making a massive fundamental shift in your socioeconomic strata and potentially even from that perspective. Now, the second question you asked is from a degree perspective, right? From how do you future proof from what you're studying perspective? AI is transforming the world. There was a recent McKinsey report said 85% of the jobs that come out in 2030 don't even exist today. So future proofing for an environment like this sounds sort of impossible. But I just published a book called Break the Career Code, and I spent almost a year and a half talking with experts, professors, industry experts across the world. And really, what came out of the book in terms of sectors to tap into, sustainability is a big theme. Green energy, green fashion, green tech. There's like a wave of green that's going to sweep through over the next 5-7 years. Space technology is a huge field. While there's all this land grabbing going on for so many centuries on Earth, and then you look at space and you say, oh my God, that is multiples of land space or air space that's also available for grabs right now. No one really owns anything in space because as of now, the laws don't allow anybody to own anything. But the minute the laws come through and there's more certainty, they've started space travel, they're setting up hospitals in space because gravitational pull is reversed in outer space. So a lot of transplants, stem cells, all that stuff. You can do a lot of things in outer space that you can't do here on Earth. And then if you're in technology, then technology is not going anywhere. There's a big debate about, is computer science going to be future-proof career to pursue? And then there's a debate around this because people are like, oh, well, if AI can code for you, then why do I need to become a computer scientist? It's sort of redundant skill set. But I still believe that, understanding how code works allows you to think in a certain way. And I'm not a developer coder. And when I look at the AI tools that exist for non-developers, so to speak, they still overwhelm me and baffle me. I'm just like, oh, I can't just go up here and build a sophisticated, solid website. Tech, computer science, whatever form of AI they're teaching. A lot of universities have introduced AI curriculums. There are degrees now. You major in AI. The efficiency of that curriculum is still questionable, right? Because it's evolving so fast. The technology, you put something in your curriculum in semester one, and by semester three, the technology is redundant. But at least it sets up a base. It gives you a base understanding of the models and how things work. And once you have that base, it's evident that that base will become very different from what you are studying today, but at least you build on that base and it enables you to then keep up with the transformations that are going to happen.
Thank you for that. And moving slightly away from our syllabus, Ivy League colleges have been the center of a lot of the lives of Indian students and families, associating Ivy League colleges to top learning and future proofing careers, because who would not want someone from an Ivy League school? But do you think that Ivy League colleges truly provide value, or are we somewhere buying into the legacy driven hype?
Oh, this is a fabulous question. So, are the Ivy League colleges, do they really stand up for what they project and what we perceive from the outside? Having been through a very intense curriculum at one of the Ivy League schools myself, it's funny, I was also skeptical. I was like, you've seen the brochures and you've heard about this university and you've seen the shows on television, and you're like, man, this all seems like a bit of fluff. So I went in as a skeptic. What is it about this university? And really, when you go, you realize, yes, it's the curriculum, but the curriculum today is, it's on the internet. You can go to Khan Academy or Coursera and figure curriculum. The professors, they managed to secure some of the finest professors in the world. If you leave aside curriculum, reputation, credibility, brand, and faculty, the one thing that really shines out in the Ivy League universities is the kind of talent that they're able to attract because of this sort of perceived hype that, hey, these Ivy Leagues are this haven for some of the smartest people, some of the most wired people, some of the people who are most interested in research, and the high threshold they set from admissions rate in the single digits every year consistently. And you're just like, wow, if you're going to reject over 90% of the people who are applying to your university, you can imagine the kind of talent pool there is. And I was just on at Harvard's campus a few weeks ago at my reunion, and it really just reminded me once again of just the sheer brilliance that you surround yourself by when you're going through the curriculum, and then for the rest of your life, right? Because then that becomes your new sort of peer group, friend circle, benchmark, aspirational crew. And that's really the big clincher. Now, the Ivy Leagues, they're a small set of universities, right, that get tagged under the Ivy League. Now, to me, that's the part that's a bit unfair, because are you really saying there's like only these handful of universities that are the best? No, the Ivy League was just a league of colleges that played football with one another. They got branded as the Ivy League, and then they made this brand really big. MIT is not an Ivy League university, right? The Ivy Leagues are just 8 colleges on the East Coast of America. MIT is on the East Coast in Massachusetts, but not part of the league because they didn't play football. Stanford's not part of the Ivy League schools either. Caltech, any college, like UC Berkeley, Caltech, Stanford, all West Coast, not part of the Ivy Leagues. All phenomenal universities. Carnegie Mellon, University of Michigan, not part of the Ivy Leagues. All the liberal art colleges, Amherst College, Swarthmore, etc., not part of the Ivy Leagues. Are these really sort of top tier colleges attracting top tier talent, professors, etc.? Absolutely, yes. So I feel like if we could just expand the Ivy League into like the Ivy League Plus and really think of the universities in a wider spectrum, then absolutely yes. But do the Ivy Leagues themselves stand for excellence? Absolutely yes.
Thank you for such a comprehensive understanding of it. Now, studying abroad is never a cheap affair. And beyond traditional education loans, what do you think are other financial avenues or options from platforms like, Prodigy Finance? What should students explore to support their international education?
So, see, a lot of times when parents are planning to send their kids abroad, it normally is not a flippant decision where they say, oh, okay, next year my child's going to graduate. Like, especially in a country like ours, where a significant portion of the household wallet is dedicated to education. People will live in a smaller home, put their homes as collateral, tone down on vacation, material goods, etc. Education comes first and foremost. In a country and a culture like India, people start saving towards their education at a very early age. A lot of the banks in India start these insurance policies. There's this early mindset to start saving for what they know is coming, right? There's no mystery around your child turning 17 or 18 and then going to college, or turning 21 and then going to grad school. So, fortunately, the timelines on this are very, very visible. So, people plan in advance. Secondly, there's now been an outburst of private sector banks in India and public sector banks tapping into the foreign education market. But be honestly, just because financially it makes a lot of sense, especially when you're funding and supporting students who are going to go to top tier universities, because you make a sweet spread as a banker on your interest rate, and the probability of default is very low considering the student is actually going to go to a top tier university. So this has become a rampant business on both public sector and private sector banks. Then come the NBFCs, as you mentioned. There's a large spectrum of NBFCs who are also supporting. There's a lot of university merit aid, need based scholarships. So if you really need the money and if you're really smart, first the university will look at you, how smart you are, and sort of the merit component. And then a lot of times they say, hey, we really just want you. What's it going to take to get you here? So when you apply to the colleges, you have to submit 3 years of income statements, household, mother, father, whoever else exists in that family. And once they do an assessment, depending on the university, their grant budget, which is why the Trump administration, slicing off the grants became such a big deal. Then the universities will pay, literally, they pay for you to come to their colleges. We've also seen cases of crowdfunding. You can put out your profile, and if you're really deserving, it's very interesting. People will actually pay for you to go to college. And then, of course, people negotiate with their employers, right? So if you tell your employer that, hey, look, I've just got into like NYU for my MBA, and if you sponsor me, I will commit to coming back to you for 2 years. And we see a lot of those cases happening. Larger firms like the consulting firms, McKinsey, BCG, etc., have this sort of embedded into their system where it's just like a standard program that from McKinsey you go and McKinsey pays for you, but there's a clause that you have to come back and work with McKinsey. So there's all these various forms of financing that have emerged in the last few years, and we see more and more of these innovations coming through. So financing your education has become, it wasn't like this. If you literally look back a decade ago, it was not so simple. But I feel like now the financing component has become easier. It's the getting into the universities that's becoming more and more competitive.
Thank you. So, reports have indicated that as Indian students go abroad, they often face cultural isolation and mental health challenges because you're in an environment that's significantly new to you in a multitude of aspects. Now, what support systems do you think that students should look for in universities to ensure their well being?
So, this cultural isolation and mental health challenges, like when I first left for the US, I had never been to the United States. I'd only seen pictures of like, Walt Disney and the stuff that you see when you think of America. And you land up in an American college and you're like, oh, wow. First of all, there was no social media. Email had just sort of emerged. We had pen pals who we'd write letters to. Now, fast forward all these years, living in a different landscape, right? With the advent of social media, rampant access to information. When I look at my niece who's like 12, fully plugged into Western culture, music, food, fashion, skincare, all of it. So I feel like this cultural isolation that used to exist, and yes, it was a problem, but with the advent of this sort of media explosion, we're watching American shows, right? Netflix didn't exist 20 years ago. Today, everyone's watching the same shows globally. So, what Thomas Friedman talked about in terms of flattening, I feel like there's a real flattening happening right now. That being said, you could come from a situation or a context where you probably weren't that exposed to this sort of culture, or even if you watched it on television, it still seemed external to you. For people like that, there are definitely well trained mental health counselors. So, one is the cultural component, which I feel like cultural really isn't so much of a big deal. But yes, mental health is definitely a theme that needs to be addressed, which has nothing to do with the cultural aspect. It could be from just being away from home, other peer pressure that may arise on Indian campuses or international campuses. A lot of universities have helped set up 24/7 helplines. They have walk in clinics that you should be aware of. A lot of them will do a cultural orientation before you start school. And I strongly recommend that all international students And actually, even local students attend the orientation programs because it really provides a sort of synthesis of cultures and understanding. A lot of colleges will also appoint counselors who are from different cultures. So there's a cultural orientation or cultural sense of like, oh, okay, this child is coming from Korea, then this is the kind of stress. So there has to be some sort of cultural understanding as well. They also constantly doing workshops on resilience, homesickness, academic stress. There's also, if you're, let's say, you're in a math class and you're struggling, there'll always be a TA who's a teaching assistant who you can access. There'll be office hours by the professors. And a lot of the stuff is a little hidden. But if you go out and seek the support, because the colleges have been seeing this now for so many years, and yes, they tweak it basis, what's really relevant at this point. But mental health is really number one on the agenda of the colleges because even from their perspective, they don't want any campus suicides or campus issues. And more importantly, on a larger scale, they really don't want graduates coming out of their universities who are, depressed or unwell or anxious because then they're not productive in the workforce. And then they don't really become alumni that colleges are going to go out and support or be proud of, etc. So they realize that, everything begins at home, which is the school campus. And then from providing that sort of safe space and access to resources will really lead to a holistic individual who comes out of that university.
Thank you. So, you mentioned that creating a foundation for a person is extremely important, and you also mentioned holistic development of an individual. Now, I'd like to ask you, besides the basic curriculum and academia that help mold an individual for the world of tomorrow, is there anything else that a student of tomorrow needs to possess to be successful?
I feel really resilience. We're living really in an era where everything changes. Who would have imagined anything like Chat GPT coming in and changing our worlds? And it's like Chat GPT is just like the early days of this technology. And this is just going to evolve. There's all sorts of reports of workforces being eliminated or changing. Are we going to have jobs? Are we going to have, companies provide basic sustenance? Well, will it happen in 3 years or 5 or 10? We don't know. Will it happen? It's going to happen, right? Like the change is obvious and inevitable. What this is going to require is this resilience. But resilience doesn't mean literally like saying, oh, I have a very firm mind and I will be resilient, or I'm physically resilient, I'm going to the gym. Resilience stems from just having a continuous learning mindset. Again, having the mindset doesn't mean much. The mindset needs to be acted upon. So what do you do if you're a resilient learner? You continuously take courses, you upskill. If you haven't still gone online and tinkered with AI, if you're not using AI on a sort of almost daily basis, so you have to sort of be up to speed with the current trend, knowing very well that, hey, in 3 months, this current so-called current trend will also be redundant and I'll have to catch the next wave. So I feel like being curious and having this mindset of continuous learning is going to be super helpful. And it'll just enable you to sort of fearlessly pivot. If you're able to fearlessly pivot, saying, oh, I always thought of myself as a social media, like a content person. Oh, I'm not required anymore because content is now, social media content comes through, GPT. Can I pivot fearlessly and upskill and move to something else? So I'm talking about the resilience from a continuous learning and curiosity perspective. The minute you develop that, then no matter what you studied at college and no matter what, because either way, that information and knowledge will become redundant as you prepare yourself for what's coming.
So, speaking about redundancy, I think that's a very common theme in Indian curricula. Even though there are a lot of quality universities, making sure that India's higher education system does not face challenges like redundant curriculum and faculty shortages. Now, how do you advise students to weigh the pros and cons of studying domestically versus abroad?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And I get asked this question a lot by lots of parents and students as well. At the core of it, I grew up in India, right? So I love my country. I've decided to come back and live here. It saddens me to see that even 20 years later, there's this mass exodus of students, having forcefully go abroad because the option pools in India are still very limited. The curriculums are now they're beginning to get a little bit more updated, but largely they've been fairly stoic. But before we get into curriculum, let's take a step back and talk about how do you get admitted to a college in India. Everything hinges upon, when you're in school, It's your board exam. How did I do on the CBSE, SSC, ICSE, whatever board you went to? That one exam is the culmination of like first to 10th grade. It's like, oh, everything hinges on this one exam. So we're dealing with the stress, the pressure, the coaching classes, tuitions, etc., just for one exam. Why? Because that one exam then determines where I'll spend the next 2 years. And then is the next exam, my HSC, the so called 12th grade. Now it's become IB or A levels or HSC or ISC, whatever board again you go to. But once again, it's the outcome of that one exam that then decides your next step. If you decide to go to the IITs or sit for the NEET, if you're medical, etc., then even these cause of no relevance, then it is the outcome of one singular test that determines the outcome of everything else. So the application process in my mind is bizarre, and the amount of pressure and therefore this rise of this coaching industry and quota as a hub, etc., to me is bizarre, right? When you apply to international schools, they look for everything. They look for evidence from the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th. They look for your grades across the years. They will forgive a weak grade if it's balanced with something else. They're looking for extracurriculars, holistic profiles, leadership positions, were you head boy, sports captain, whatever. Have you done any research? So it's more sort of holistic. It's also forgiving in some way, saying, hey, we'll forgive a low grade in the ninth, but we want to see sort of 4 years of consistent data validating my high school experience versus a one entrance test. Now let's assume I, crack the IITs, I enter the IITs. I'm going to get a degree thrown at me basis my rank. That again to me is bizarre because and the ranking system is like, oh, the top, I don't know, 100 students or whatever will get computer science, the next will get mechanical. I don't have any control over my intended major just because the IIT system doesn't allow for this sort of preference. Then you land up at the college and you realize that while the IQ is very strong of these candidates, I've been running an IIT internship program in my organization for the last 9 years. And as we speak, I have, three interns in the office, very high IQ, very sweet people, firstly. Soft skills and communication, very, very low. So the colleges don't train them on communication. So in an office setup, while they might be doing all the hard work, in the meeting room, they're not able to convey what they're actually doing. The application process, the degree allocation, and the lack of soft skills, these are like my three big moot points with the Indian education system.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And my last question to you is, what is one mindset shift you believe Indian students must adopt to thrive in this ever evolving landscape of global education? And part two of that is, there are a lot of changes that are happening in this entire curriculum. You want to be in a particular place and you work your whole life towards it, but sometimes things don't always go your way. Now, for students to be quick on their feet, what are your words of advice so that students can adapt more easily to situations that don't necessarily go their way?
A lot of people make the mistake of trying to tap into a network when they really need somebody. But I think we need to make that shift from saying, hey, let me build a network before I need the network. And that's like, because of, it seems bizarre saying, hey, but I don't really need anyone in government. So why should I build a network? But and the other thing with a lot of people think of networking is like, hey, what can I get? What am I going to get from talking to you? What am I going to get from sort of sending you a note or helping you or whatever? In these conversations, I always explain to people that the efficient way of building a network is, shift the mindset from getting to giving. If you want to build a successful network, focus on what is it that I can offer to an individual. That's it. That is a one-sided equation as far as you're concerned. The more you focus on what am I able to contribute, am I able to contribute to someone's mental well-being? Am I able to contribute to someone from a materialistic perspective? Am I able to contribute from a well-being perspective? Am I able to just invite somebody over for a coffee, go for a jog with someone, invite someone to a concert? What have you got to offer? And the minute you shift the lens to offering as opposed to receiving, you will build a phenomenal network, because the receiving will come automatically. Like the receiving is secondary, and it's sort of automatic and magical. Really just focus on the giving, and then the networks build seamlessly. And the minute you have those networks in this sort of disruptive, ever evolving universe, it's the networks you would lean on, right? The network in for your next job, the network when you're going through a downturn in your emotional behavior and say, hey, I just looking for a couple of friends to just have, a night out with. So those networks could be of various forms, shapes, power, influence, monetary aspects. It doesn't really matter, because as we live our lives, you realize, it's not just network doesn't mean just somebody really rich and wealthy who is well connected. It also just means having a shoulder to cry on. So I would suggest build a network along the spectrum, and to focus on the giving rather than the receiving.
Thank you. Yes, what a beautiful note to end this conversation. Our focus on giving rather than receiving, and not just the material aspects, but also in life, because you learn more that way. Thank you so much, Vibha, for sharing your valuable insights today. Your expertise truly illuminates the paths for students navigating this complex and often uncertain worlds of international education.
Thank you.
From managing visa challenges and financial planning to mental health support and embracing emerging trends like AI and alternative credentials, we hope Vibha's guidance helped demystify the journey and empowered you to make informed, resilient decisions. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of the EdexLive podcast. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.